Sovet dövrü və müstəqilliyinin ilk illərindən başlayaraq Azərbaycan haqqında Birləşmiş Ştatlarda tədqiqat aparan professor Audrey Altstadt Azərbaycan haqqında yeni kitab üzərində işləyir. Professor Altstadtın Azərbaycan Türkləri adlı kitabı təkcə ABŞ deyil, Qərbdə Azərbaycan tarixi haqqında ən müfəssəl tədqiqatlardan biri hesab edilir. Yeni kitabını müzakirə etmək üçün professor Audrey Altstadtı studiyamıza dəvət etmişik. Welcome to our program, Professor Altstadt.
Çok sağ olun, thank you so much.
It has been almost 23 years since you published your first book, seminal book, on the history of Azerbaijan, the Azerbaijani Turks, Power and Identity. Now you are working on a new book. What is this book about? What do you wish to tell your audience about Azerbaijan?
Well, thank you, Dilshad, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here and to see you again. Actually, I am currently working on a book, but I've also just finished a book before I came here to Washington, D.C. So I'd like to talk about both of those, actually. The first one is a history of the creation of Soviet Azerbaijani culture during the 1920s and 30s. And I'm really excited about that book, and I'm really proud of the work that I was able to do during that work, as I was producing that book. And it gives me a chance really to look back at the pre-revolutionary period of the changes of Azerbaijani culture in the pre-war period, and to look at some of the important personalities of that time period, the literature, the performing arts, the advances in education, the efforts to bring women into a more equal position in society. And then after that, the book really concentrates on the 1920s and 30s on some very important cultural areas. Not just the alphabet change, which is, I think, what everybody thinks about when you think about language and culture in the 20s and 30s, but also the real language reforms, the standardization of language, the development of the literary language that exists now, and actually banning of words, criminalizing the use of certain words and of even certain spellings of words in 1937. And then other parts of the book deal with education, advanced scholarship, the struggle between the university and the Polytechnic Institute, and then finally literature and writers. And I'm really hoping for that. In this book, my audience is not only an American audience, it's just as much an Azerbaijani audience, because I'm asking different questions and I'm looking at different things in that book than my Azerbaijani colleagues have done in their work on the same issues. And that book I did finish and revise last year, and it's under consideration right now at a press, and I'm hoping that they will like it and that it will be out in another year or so. To answer your first question, I'm here in Washington at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and I'm working on a really different project for me. As a historian, I've of course always worked on the late 19th and first part of the 20th centuries, and then I've moved into the post-World War II period, as you know, for the first book, which you very kindly mentioned. This book is really a longevity study of post-Soviet Azerbaijan. As a historian, I study the past, but I live in the future, in the present, like everyone else does. And so this book is called Frustrated Democracy in Post-Soviet Azerbaijan. And it's an examination of several different factors in Azerbaijan's post-Soviet history. The movement which I lived through, and which many of us lived through, toward democratization in government and society in the early 90s, and then what I see as a movement away from democratization in the period since about the mid-1990s. And there are many different facets to this, of course. I'm putting the study within the larger context that has two components. One of these is something that everyone, I think, is very familiar with, and that's Azerbaijan's geopolitical position. It is the only country that borders both Russia and Iran, and that creates certain continuing challenges for any government that might be in power in Baku. There's also the farther regional context that Azerbaijan is really on the frontier between Not to use a stereotype, but it's simply easier to be able to say Europe and Asia, the East and the West, the Muslim world and the Christian world. And although that is not a very simple line, it's sort of a frontier zone. Azerbaijan is really right there because it has neighbors that are part of the Christian world, neighbors that are part of the Muslim world, and even within Azerbaijan we see, of course, Sunni and Shia Muslims. So there's that as a larger context. The other part of that large context, of course, is the occupation of so much Azerbaijani territory by Armenian forces and the still unresolved conflict over Karabakh. And so those two things are issues that I'm contextualizing the study with. But the real issues really have to do with the impact of very large amounts of oil money, especially since the completion of the BTC pipeline. That's one chapter, the impact of that, the impact on society, the really surprising levels of corruption at very high levels in the economy and, of course, in government as well. There's also a chapter on the squeezing of civil society. And this is not only to talk about what has been called the crackdown of 2014, but I see a much larger trajectory in which the space for public discourse, the space for the functioning of opposition parties, and the ability of the media to discuss and to report on the multifaceted ideas which exist in Azerbaijani society. Also the repression against religious expression with the excuse that all of it is extremism. And of course, all of it's not extremism. And so these are the different components of this study. I'm hoping to be finished with it within the next couple of months.
In 1980, when you visited Azerbaijan for the first time, it was part of the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. Then when you finished your first book, Azerbaijan had just become an independent country in 1991. Now Azerbaijan is a full-fledged member of the international community. How are the challenges different from those in its early years of independence?
Yes, indeed, it's a very different situation. In 1991 and 92, Azerbaijan was really in the throes of the fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Dagla-Karabakh. And it also was under the pressure of the still existing Soviet armed forces that were still not only stationed in Azerbaijan, but really had lost their discipline. And they were selling weapons and they were just really sort of roaming around the country. So it was a very unstable and very dangerous time. But at the same time, people were very hopeful. And I think people were hopeful because they were really so tired of the Soviet system. They were so tired of control from Moscow, the lack of investment and the underdevelopment in infrastructure, the pressures on what they could say openly, the inability very often to use Azerbaijani, the native language. And you know, I've known you for long enough and you've seen this yourself, and I've seen it, how delighted people were that a foreigner, in this case, I as a foreigner, but other foreigners would come to the country and speak Azerbaijani and not to use Russian, not insist that everybody use Russian because that person's a foreigner. And so those are the kinds of things that were challenges, how to deal with the crumbling of the Soviet regime, the structure, the values, and to find something new. And people were frightened and they were uncertain, but I think the educated stratum of the country really had a clear vision, and they understood that they wanted to establish a more democratic system. And when I think back about the early opposition groups, the Popular Front and all of the parties that came out of the Popular Front, those were people who had a very good understanding that democracy entailed public debate. It meant give and take. It did mean having more than one candidate for an election, but it also meant that you might have disagreements. It meant that you might be able to find ways of resolving problems, but those were going to require some compromise. And people really felt that they could build a system like that. The problems were, of course, the administrative difficulties and the economic difficulties as well, because Azerbaijan had not received really a fair share of Soviet investment, and oil was still in the ground. And it was impossible in those days to figure out how it was going to reach international markets. Now you have very different kinds of problems. Azerbaijan is known really all over the world as an oil producer, as a natural gas producer. It's connected to world networks. Economically speaking, it's connected to world networks in terms of its political life. There are embassies all over the world. Embassies of other countries are in Baku. The challenge now, I think, is really very different. There are both foreign challenges, because Russia is not only strong again, but it's also very aggressive. Iran is very strong, and it is aggressive in a somewhat different way. I think Iran is not an expansionist power politically or militarily, but it does try to exert its influence through religion and through the training of people in Iran who then go to Azerbaijan and spread, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, Iranian influence. In some senses, the greatest challenge is the internal challenge. It's the domestic challenge. Because over the last several years, again, not just since 2014, but for several years now, we've seen a growing intolerance of the ruling party and the regime and the circles around it, an intolerance of debate and disagreement. And that means that all of the genuine intelligence and wisdom that we see in Azerbaijan, that I'm very well aware of because of my contacts with colleagues and with other people there, is not coming out. The society can't benefit from it. The government can't even benefit from it because these things are being suppressed. And there's a real question whether the government of Azerbaijan is really still interested in leaning toward a Western kind of democratic system, or whether, in fact, in the interests of protecting itself and its own interests, it's actually moving more toward Russia, toward Russian-dominated alliances, and so on. And I think Azerbaijanis as a whole would like very much to participate in making that kind of a decision, and they're not being given the opportunity right now.
Professor Altstadt, how did you envision the future of Azerbaijan, and how does that vision match with what you see? You know the country very well. You are observing all developments in the country for almost 3 decades.
3 decades, that's true, isn't it? Yes, that is true. I think my vision for the future of Azerbaijan, if I think back to 1991, 92, 93, I was envisioning that over time, all of the very able and intelligent people in the country would be able to solve, with foreign assistance, I mean, that's certainly true, some of the economic problems, the problems of housing, the problems of infrastructure, the problems of employment. And those things really could all have gone together. During the 1990s, there were a lot of challenges, and I don't want to diminish the importance of that. But building up the infrastructure would have provided jobs, would have allowed people then to learn how to interact with their Western counterparts or with people from other countries, and gradually to be able to build up education and jobs and professionalism and so on. Under those circumstances, then, when the oil pipeline was constructed and all the additional money came in, there would have been an opportunity for the money to be distributed throughout society in a way that would really have raised the level of living, the standards of living of lots of people. There would have been a very large and solid middle class. Western countries have their problems too. I'm not envisioning that every problem in Azerbaijan would have been solved by these things. But there would have been a public discourse. There would have been, of course, some of the chaotic arguments and discussions that we see in Western countries. Whether you look at the United States or any other country in the Western world, there are disputes and there are disagreements. And sometimes they're very nasty disagreements, and people use resources in order to try to win their point and win people over to their visions. And I think that one of the problems with bringing that kind of a system into Azerbaijan is that the Azerbaijanis themselves were not expecting it. They did not realize that democracy was going to be a little bit chaotic, and that the discourse and the arguments were going to be somewhat chaotic. And I think that was frightening to them. I think there was also the problem that they were expecting that democracy was going to mean prosperity, and it doesn't always mean that. An American businessman said to me once, many years ago, that the free market and freedom in economic life means the freedom to fail as well as the freedom to succeed. And that's something people were not ready for. But when I look at Azerbaijan today, I do see a lot of the positives of wealth, but it's very concentrated in a very small stratum. Baku is lovely. I was there last year at this time, and it's been transformed into a very beautiful city. But I know that there's a human cost behind that, which visitors don't always see. I know that the human cost had to do with people being thrown out of their apartment buildings, the buildings being razed to the ground, and people are still stuck in interim housing, and they don't have places to go, and there may not be jobs. I know that pensions have not been raised adequately. I know that the salaries of teachers and medical workers are still too low. And yet at the same time, there's a small number of people who have benefited far out of proportion to anyone's contribution to this improvement, and that there is tremendous corruption at high levels. And these are the things that I did not expect. And we know there's corruption everywhere, but the degree of corruption that we're seeing and the degree of greed that people are, this comes to my mind really in Azerbaijani, yığır, bu mallara, pullara ve başkalar cemaatin ekseriyeti kasıb qalır. Ama bu bir balıcı deste çok varlı olur. So there are many beautiful things. And if the regime were to decide that it wanted to open up that space and allow people to share in all of this wealth, I think Azerbaijan could really improve itself. And these are very much domestic. These are not a foreigner suggesting interference from the outside. This is really an opportunity, I think. There are opportunities, and I think that it's not being allowed to happen.
And one more question.
Yes.
Some observers suggest that Azerbaijan is getting closer to Russia, especially after the military intervention of Ukraine. Do you think that the United States missed the opportunity with that regard?
I have to say that I think the United States missed several opportunities, but I don't think that in the last year the U.S. had much of an opportunity. I think the biggest opportunity the United States missed, to be frank, really had to do with the sanctions amendment to the Freedom Support Act, the infamous Section 907, early in the 1990s. That was a huge missed opportunity when the United States could have really given very much desired assistance to Azerbaijan when Azerbaijan was asking for it and looking for it. And that could have shaped Azerbaijan's democratic institutions in a very different way. I think there were probably later opportunities as well for the United States to give meaningful and desired help to Azerbaijan. But I think that by the time we got to last year, with the problems of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the seizure of Crimea, which looks, of course, Azerbaijanis look at that and recognize parallels with the Karabakh problem. I think that by then the United States really did not have as much of an opportunity to really interfere to assist in Azerbaijan or in Azerbaijani politics. And I think that had to do with an earlier focus much more on Russia than on the Caucasus. And I think that was one of the mistakes that the U.S. government made. And I was sorry to see that happen, because I think there's a lot of room for fruitful cooperation. So as I said, I don't think that was so much the missed opportunity, but I think there were others beforehand.
Thank you very much, Professor Altstadt.
You're very welcome.